We did use a lot of special effects in those early days with the Wright brothers. And the only, all we got out of the special effects were we did get a lot of laughs because many times things didn't work. But we were using something called chroma key, which is sticking somebody in front of a blue screen and blue screening them and then dissolving one over the other, and you could bring people out of portraits and do all kinds of things. It was all very basic and very simple. We did have the occasional bat hanging on a string, the rubber bat, and a few things like that. But the guy who was working for me on the show as the producer, Bob Costello, is good at that stuff. He came up with, he had the jump on a lot of people. And when ABC decided to move the show from 3:30 to 4, we realized that not only did we now have the women, but we had all these kids that were huge fans of the show. And we knew that before, of course, because outside the studio on 53rd Street, when we would come out at the end of the day, they could be up to 500 kids out there yelling and screaming for autographs. And they would write the names of their favorite actors on the wall of the building in magic marker or something. And I would tell the actors, you better take a good look at that wall. I don't want to catch anybody out there at night putting their own name on there. Your name starts to disappear. You lose your count out there. The wall count is very serious. But we knew we had this great kid audience. And when they moved it to 4:30, or when it was just made it easier for the kids to come home. So it was no big surprise that kids like this kind of thing. None of the things that happened after the show became supernatural were part of the original concept. None of them. And when I knew that I had to find a way to perpetuate the vampire since he became the star of the show, I got a pretty good imagination. And I reached the point where I didn't know what I was going to do next. What kind of a story could I come up with to keep this guy going? And I was always fascinated by time travel, which is part of how this happened. I love time travel. I don't like so much going forward into the future, but I love the stories that take you back into the past. And I've done a number of them other than this. And I thought, wait a minute, why don't we go back into the past and find out how Barnabas became a vampire? People have got to wonder, how did he become a vampire? And we'll have a whole other story we can do in the past. And that's what we did. And wow, you talk about success. It was our most popular story. I never wanted to get out of the past. I stayed there forever. And the thing that was so wonderful about it is when Victoria was transported back through a seance, that was my device, and she walks into Collinwood, or the old house, the way it was in those days, and there are all the same actors playing different roles. The audience went nuts over that. They just loved that. And she kept playing it like is she in a dream? Is she dreaming this? Who are these people? Why are they different? The biggest problem for me on Dark Shadows was to constantly come up with stories. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if I could bring in another character that was equally as popular as Barnabas, so that every story didn't have to be tied to the vampire, which was the problem with the show. Because if you didn't have the vampire operating as a vampire, the audience wasn't very happy. So it was a true challenge to try and find something else that really worked. And one of my favorite stories is Turn of the Screw, which incidentally I did my own version of, with Len Redgrave. But I always loved Turn of the Screw, and I thought, well, let's see, do a little rip-off of a Turn of a Screw, do our own little version of some kind of a spirit coming to possess the souls of the children. And we brought this little girl onto the show. And normally the way I would start these ideas, it seems to me was always on dark, snowy nights in New York with the writers and I up in my office, and we were on Park Avenue, I guess, at that time, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. And everybody's saying, what are we going to do next? And suddenly I get the image of something. And I said, there's a telephone, there's an old telephone, and it starts to ring. The kids have found this telephone in the closed-off section of the house, and the telephone starts to ring. And the little girl picks up the phone, and she starts speaking into it. And the little boy said, oh, come on, what are you doing? There's nobody on that phone. And she said, oh, yes, there is. And she hands him the telephone, and he hears it breathing on the other end, and then a click. And it's something like that, okay? And that's how we started with the Quentin character. And the reason his name was Quentin was Peter Quint in Turn of the Screw. And it became fascinating. We never wanted him to talk because as a silent figure, he was terrifying. And I always started to think, suppose it's like silent films go on the talkies. When the time comes, when he has to talk, the audience is going to hate him, right? What are we going to do? But they loved him. And he became this gigantic hit. And the children go into the old closed-off wing, and Quentin sitting in his frock coat with his high collar, and the record playing, the old record playing on the gramophone. And oh, geez, it was a great story, and the audience loved that story. I went back to the past to find out Quentin's story, and I think he was some kind of a werewolf or something was involved in that story. I always tried to stay away from werewolves because I felt they were so hokey, but we finally had to give in and do a werewolf story. The reason we went to the classics as much as we did, ripping off portions of Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights or Turn of the Screw or any of these things, is that all stories are basically the same. These are great story elements, and to put our own spin on them. And it's so difficult to think of a story that hasn't in some way been done. And why not go right to the gold mine where it all really lies? I mean, we never did Turn of the Screw, but we certainly took elements from Turn of the Screw. We did Frankenstein. We built our own monster. Some were more successful than others. But it's a great source. And since I loved all that material, I had great fun in doing our own version of Frankenstein. I just kept picturing the old Frankenstein movies and the electrodes and everything flashing, and the monster. It was great. I didn't know what else I was going to do. I couldn't think of another idea. And I got into the parallel time thing, which saved me for a while. The audience liked the parallel time story because it's like time travel. But then we started getting into things like the Leviathan and stuff like that. And I was becoming very disenchanted right along with the audience. And probably over the last 6 months of that film, people didn't see a lot of me. I mean, during that last 6 months of the show, I was just hoping it was going to end. I just wanted to move on. I couldn't squeeze my brain any harder to come up with one more story, and I just wanted to move on and out.